Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA exists for one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to support animal studies scholars. So if you're an animal studies scholar, you should be a member of ASA. ASA is your organisation. So jump online and check out ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is also coming to you from Canterbury, and I've got another wonderful guest from the University of Kent, or Kent University, I should say. Now, we're in a bit of a noisy environment, so we're actually not recording on campus today. We're in the lobby of a hotel, so you're going to hear quite a bit of ambient noise. There's music playing in the background. There are people enjoying cocktails on a lovely sunny Saturday afternoon, but please don't be put off by the ambient noise. I've got an absolutely wonderful guest. This week I'm joined by Dr Kristof Dhont. Kristof is Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Kent, and we're going to discuss his journal article, Common Ideological Roots of Speciesism and Generalized Ethnic Prejudice, the Social Dominance Human-Animal Relations Model, which appeared in the European Journal of Personality. And we should give a quick shout out to his co-authors, Gordon Hodson and Anna C. Leite. Welcome to the podcast, Kristofs.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you and great to have this conversation. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
It's wonderful to have you here. Now, Kristofs, why this paper? What inspired it?
Well, I was inspired by animal activists using all these slogans, especially in radical circles, using slogans about that speciesism, and it takes a while before you can actually pronounce that correctly.
It certainly does.
But like equating speciesism with other types of prejudice, like racism and sexism. So, and also looking at some of the campaigns that have been done in the past by organizations like PETA, they've used quite explicit materials about comparing the Holocaust with the situation we know from pictures from slaughterhouses or industrial factory farming and so on. So, and then you have that whole scholarship and work in philosophy who has been doing quite similar things, but then in their writings, such as the book Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, the work by Carol Adams and her book Sexual Politics of Meat, where they're very explicitly comparing racism or sexism with meat consumption or with animal exploitation. So, and I was a bit surprised that this has been going on for such a long time in philosophy and animal advocacy scenes, but if you look at the literature in psychology, you couldn't find any evidence for that. It has not been empirically tested. So I thought, well, that would be a great study. And we have actually now the means and the measures to measure all those variables and those concepts, and to just ask people about their attitudes towards animals, towards other outgroups. And we start with focusing on generalized ethnic prejudice, generalized prejudice towards ethnic and religious minority groups, and to see whether, if we measure that, on the one hand, attitudes towards animals, speciesism, and support for animal exploitation, whether that would be related to their attitudes towards ethnic minority groups. So our prediction based on philosophy and that theorizing, but also on the idea that there's something like a generalized prejudice that we know from a long time in social psychology and personality psychology, that if you tend to be more prejudiced towards one outgroup, you tend to be more prejudiced towards multiple other outgroups as well. So in some of my previous work, but it has been tested by so many scholars across the world, is that if you tend to score higher on racism scales, you tend to score higher on scales of homophobia or sexism and so on. But that has just to repeat, that was only tested for prejudice towards human outgroups. If you look at speciesism, you could start coming up all kinds of reasons why it might not be the same, because it's about animals. And so far, we don't have that substantial knowledge base about how people perceive animals, non-human animals, I should specify there. So we just went on testing that idea, and we conducted numerous studies, first in Canada, then in Belgium, samples from the UK and samples from the US. And systematically we found that same observation, that it's indeed the case that when you support animal exploitation more, and therefore also score higher on speciesism, you also tend to score higher on negative attitudes towards ethnic outgroups. So basically, that basic observation was confirmed in several studies, hundreds of respondents. And also other groups have been testing that. Now recently, a group of Oxford have replicated those findings. Basically we found evidence for these claims. I don't want to say that for that reason, that speciesism is exactly the same as sexism, just like sexism is not exactly the same as racism. But at least the idea that these things are all intercorrelated or connected to each other, or in intersectionality approach, intersecting with each other, that seems to be something true. All right.
Well, that's a very big relief for all the people who, as you say, have been running campaigns in this way for many, many years. So your paper's really interesting. It's very long and quite complicated. For the non-experts or non-psychologists listening, can you tell us a little bit about how you actually tested for this?
Well, so far we have been conducting survey studies that's literally asking people to self-report their ideas about animals and their ideas about ethnic outgroups. And if you do that in an anonymous way so that they can freely express their views, they're quite open and honest about it. So we gave them questions such as how do you generally feel towards Muslims, towards immigrants, towards a number of other ethnic groups. And then also gave them a number of questions, whether it's justified to exploit animals for their own use, whether it's justified to hold animals in very confined conditions, such as in factory farms, for raising them for meat consumption, whether it's justified to use animals in circuses, and so on. A wide range of animal practice. We're also about hunting, about whaling practices. And once you measure numerous of these different attitudes towards animals and practices of animal exploitations, you get a reliable idea, a reliable scale, a reliable score of how they generally view how justified it is to use animals for human benefits, right? So, and that's the core idea behind the idea of speciesism as well, that human interest comes in first and are often justified to abuse animals for their own cause. Yeah.
So you talk about social dominance theory in the paper. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how you apply it to the human-animal case?
So yeah, once we established that relation, the next question was, why are these concepts all interconnected? And from social psychological theorizing, we already knew that certain ideological orientations, certain ideological attitudes often drive all these negative attitudes with different outgroups and prejudiced attitudes. And social dominance orientation is a key variable there, and it's the general preference that one group dominates over others in society. And also, it's an anti-egalitarian view of how society should be structured. You think that by nature of whatever justification you have for that is that you see that society is best structured in an unequal way, where some groups are really the dominant groups in society and rule the place, basically. So. And it's also more generally social dominance theory is a way to view or explain why there's so much systemic discrimination going on. And at the psychological level, you have that key concept there. Social dominance orientation is the individual difference variable there. In the late 90s, launched by Felicia Prato and Jim Sidanius. And they wrote a brilliant book about it, social dominance theory. And at the individual level, it's a way to see how people individually different from each other and the way they want to see more or less social dominance or inequality in society. And our thinking was, well, given that social dominance orientation is such a key predictor of all these types of prejudice, why shouldn't we extend that concept also to include the scope of animals there? And that's also what we thought would be the basic or the explaining variable or the root cause why different types of prejudice and also towards animals would be connected to attitudes towards human outgroups, right? So we also statistically tested that in all our samples, and every time we first observed the basic relationship between ethnic prejudice and speciesism, and then once we accounted for social dominance orientation, the relation, statistically speaking, disappeared, which means that social dominance orientation is really a key driver behind that relations. And yeah, so hopefully that's a bit clear.
It is. So I'm just wondering to myself, if I was, say, running an animal advocacy organisation or trying to design a campaign, what could I do with this information? What would it mean? I mean, I guess you're saying that if someone's a racist, they're possibly also a speciesist. How can we turn that into a positive or use that for the benefit, to make the world a better place in some way?
Well, that's a very difficult question because we don't know whether you can really use that information to run an effective campaign to improve the conditions for animals or vegan campaigning or whatever you want to do. And I think we need to be very careful with that type of messaging because we also know that it can offend people and instead of convince people. And it can. We know that a number of these campaigns, especially the very explicit one in the early 2008, I think there was quite a bit of controversy about it when PETA used these campaign strategies. And they kind of offended quite a lot of these minority groups because they couldn't understand the basic idea behind the campaign. Well, that's what my interpretation would be. They didn't understand it. They found it very offensive. And these topics are very sensitive, especially if you make comparisons to the Holocaust or and so on, or slavery. It's not an easy message, and you might actually get the opposite results than that what you want to achieve. So my basic idea now is that the basic rationale behind it. We have established this relation, and this is important to know to understand society as a whole and to understand how people view animals and other ethnic outgroups. So it's contributing to that literature, to that understanding where our attitudes are coming from. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can use that information immediately or without hesitation to set up new campaigns and to provide that those findings from my studies just to convince other people that it's worth to care about animals.
Interesting. So, Kristof, how has the psychology community responded to your research and your inquiry in this area?
I've been receiving lots of positive reactions on it, and together with some other psychologists who have been doing research on attitudes towards meat consumption or from a different angle, from different theorizing. It used to be a bit harder to convince social psychology, personality psychology, or psychologists in general that this is a topic worthy of investigation in the first place. Since the 50s, after World War II, the field, like the most studied topic in social psychology, is really racial prejudice, and then also sexism research is a huge topic in social psychology. But there's almost no research today still on speciesism and attitudes towards animals. And finally, we have the feeling since recent years, after publishing a few of those findings, together with not only my own publications, but also other great scholars in the field of moral psychology and so on. we have the feeling that the community psychology and the scientific enterprise become more open to see animals as a social group, to see speciesism as a topic that is really in need of investigation, and to also with the societal push towards meat reduction at the moment, it seems like a lot more openness towards these topics.
How wonderful. Well, Kristof, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Let me see if I have my notes then before say I'm ready. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, I'm ready.
You're ready. Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
That's an easy question because the answer is no, not really. I can't really remember. But one of definitely one of the books that was quite early on my bookshelf was Tom Reagan's book, The Case for Animal Rights. I read about it when I took an introductory module in philosophy. When I was studying back in Belgium, it must have been my first year in bachelor at university there, and the lecturer then he mentioned Tom Reagan's work and made the connection with Rawls' justice theory. And that was quite inspiring. And then I went on buying that book, reading it. So that's must have been one of the first, but I can't really confirm that it was exactly the first.
Well, we'll take that as the first asterisk.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, most of my research has been done on prejudice and prejudice reduction, and within political psychology, also on ideology. So, and my PhD was on the influence on intergroup contact on prejudice reduction. It's a huge literature on that topic as well. So it took me a while until I was in my latest years of my PhD that I start to consider also investigating attitudes towards animals. And especially during my postdoc, I started collaborating with my colleague in Canada, Gordon Hodson, on these topics, and we found a lot of common ground there to investigate these topics. And the first article that we've published together on that, but he published earlier a few really good papers with his PhD students at that time. But my first paper was in 2014 published, so I wrote it first in 2013, probably. Empirical work, very brief, quite a brief article, but 2 survey studies looking at how ideological variables, including also social dominance orientation, again, are connected with meat consumption and with speciesism or support for animal exploitation, and the role of human supremacy beliefs there. And also another interesting variable that we came up with was what we call perceived vegetarianism threat, like whether how much meat consumer or people in general see the rise of vegetarianism as a threat to their traditional practices and to the economy that they of their country. And what we see is that also that the high people perceive vegetarianism as a threat to their own customs and traditions and their own practices. They tend to consume more meat as well. So it's and I think there's an important message there also for animal advocates there. Like the moment they are perceived as being threatening to traditions or customs that people are really used to, it becomes a lot harder to convince them of vegetarianism. So it's and of course you want to change radically the way they do things, but you also need to keep in mind that people like their traditions. People on average, people like their traditions and like having these family moments to share the family meal, and that's often centered around meat. So yeah, that's kind of a difficult question to address from an animal advocacy perspective.
Fascinating. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So that's, again, a hard question because I don't typically think in terms of single authors doing one single fantastic piece of work, because increasingly I've been thinking about scholarship and science in general as a collaborative practice within a community. So ideas are never coming from one person who wrote it down, but it's really a dynamic between different scholars and scientists discussing quite similar ideas and then being challenged by others, often at conferences or at meetings, but also in the literature. So, and that really gives rise to the best theories after a whole debate. So, within like I already mentioned Tom Regan as a philosopher that quite had an influence on my thinking about these topics even before I went on studying all these topics during my PhD and later on. But then definitely the work of Carol Adams also inspired me quite a bit. And I've been reading quite broadly in animal studies, more generally animal behavior studies. The work of Mark Beckhoff is quite interesting to read. Also mentioned Peter Singer already. But within my own field, I do also want to mention a few people that inspired me to do that kind of research.
You're stretching the one bit here, Kristofs.
Exactly.
Now keep going.
Exactly, because that is in line with my idea about it's a community doing all of this. I think really pioneering research has been done within social psychology and psychology, and moral psychology was done by Kimberly Costello and Gordon Hodson before I met Gordon myself and Kimberly myself on the interspecies model of prejudice, where they linked dehumanization to how people basically see animals, and animalistic dehumanization of outgroups would lose the key points of their work. There was that animalistic dehumanization of outgroups would lose its whole meaning if animals would be treated better, because they would have a higher status and it would not be used anymore to dehumanize outgroups in that sense. So I find that quite a good. And they run a couple of studies on that. I wrote a couple of papers on that. I found that very inspiring also for my own work. And then another team of researchers have been investigating what they've called the meat paradox, and that's from cognitive dissonance theory, and that's scholars from Australia. Brock Bastian and Steve Lohnen spring to mind here. Steve is now in University of Edinburgh, but Brock is still in Melbourne running moral psychology labs there. So I think they also did pioneering work, how difficult, and also show in their work how difficult it is to convince people to change meat consumption, basically.
Wonderful.
That was my single author.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
So, again, that's I think all your questions are quite difficult to answer with one single line, but I think whatever you choose to do to help animals, I think everyone should start thinking about all aspects of their efforts and whether they ways how we use our time and financial resources, how to optimize those. And that's quite inspired by the effective altruism movement. And I don't think I agree 100% with all the principles of effective altruism, but I think it's a really good way to look into the long-term future, what you want to achieve and how can you achieve that most effectively. And that also counts for researchers, and that's your question, academics, what they can do for animals. And that's on the one hand, if you really want to contribute to this movement or to the whole enterprise of helping animals, it's kind of, first of all, building that knowledge base based on sound scientific research, how people view and behave towards animals, because there's basically not that much. Lots of things have been written about it, but not a lot of evidence is there to really know what's going on. And then once we establish that knowledge base, or simultaneously, we also need to work together with animal advocates and test intervention studies, go into the real world and do randomized control trials to see what's really helping in terms of animal advocacy. Because there's so many strategies out there and we have no idea whether they are effective. I don't think there's one effective way. There are multiple effective ways that work simultaneously, like creating societal change. But there are definitely also aspects of the strategy that probably are not very effective, and if we can already rule out a few of those and spend our money on the ones that we know that are effective, I think that would be a big step forward in animal advocacy as well, and in helping animals in the end.
Absolutely. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
That's a very big question, and that's an easier question, and I don't think, well, there's no pragmatic answer to that, but and if I can give you one idea, I think a large-scale societal shift towards veganism will be the one thing that would have a huge impact on the environment, on people's health, but of course also on the animals themselves.
Wonderful. Well, what are you working on next?
We have a number of projects in the pipeline now, and submitted several papers. One big project I'm working at the moment is really exciting, but lots of work is I'm putting a book together on why we love and exploit animals. It should be published in 2019, somewhere after the summer. I'm doing that together with Gordon Hodson, and we wrote to a number of psychologists from my own field that we already kind of knew, who contributed chapters to the book, but we also wrote to invited animal advocates, and we invited scholars from outside psychology. So that's quite an exciting project to work and bring all these ideas together in one book. And the most interesting part of it is kind of that not everyone agrees with everyone's approach, and that's what we need to have. We need to have constructive discussions and disagreement, and see where we can find common ground to work on the same cause. Because I truly believe that 99% of the people within the movement, and also from a scholar's perspective, or actually have the same ideas in mind, what they want to achieve. The only thing is different is that how to achieve it, and we need to open that debate a bit more without be really open-minded to other people's perspectives there.
Wonderful. So everyone should keep an eye out for that book. Yeah. Where can people follow you or find out about your work?
So I have a website now. Last year I started my really create a research lab about it with my PhD students. But in the meantime, also a number of the other colleagues joined my research lab, and it's called Shark Lab. It's the study for human intergroup and animal relations at Kent. Mm-hmm. And so if you Google it, you can find it. And then also I have a Google Scholar profile, like most academics these days. So you can also find my work there. And the Shark Lab website gives you a bit more information, also information about the projects that my PhD students are working on at the moment within this theme of human-animal relations from a psychological perspective. There's quite a lot going on there.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to some very interesting and informative outputs from you. No time to rest. And thank you for joining us for Knowing Animals. And thank you to the audience for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can like us on Facebook, and you can follow us on Instagram. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.